episode of the Spinning Wheels Motorsport podcast. And of course, listening to this wherever you download your podcast, you can also watch on YouTube all the shows so far. As Guy and I first discussed this show during lockdown 1, it seems strangely fitting that we should be continuing the series as we go into the second national lockdown. Guy, you managed to squeeze in some races in a variety of historic racing cars at Goodwood Speed Week. How did that go?
Yeah, it wasn't great, Paul, but it was still nice to get back, in a race car and be at a racetrack. I think, we all love, being at the racetrack, and that's what we all enjoy. So, it's nice. It was nice to get back. I think this hopefully is going to be a short lockdown, and we can get back to racing again. In preparation fully for next year's race calendar, and hopefully we'll get a full season in next year, whatever we end up doing. So.
Yeah, hopefully the crowds will be good anyway. Now, we should probably mention our guest from way back in episode 4, Elvin Evans, with the cancellation of Ypres and the season now really in jeopardy. Let's face it, due to the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. We could actually see another British World Rally Champion crowned without turning another wheel. Guy, that's only half the story though, because throughout this series we've heard about how hard work triumphs above bad luck and adversity. And Elvin has had to dig deep to get to where he is now, so it won't be an easy won championship, even if he is crowned before the next round, will it?
I mean, he's had talk about ups and downs. I mean, I've kind of seen it firsthand from his time at M Sport, and he's really had a roller coaster career so far. But he kind of hit his stride, didn't he, this year? With once he got that Toyota, he really kind of found his feet and found his confidence. And if he does get crowned world champion this year, some people will say, well, it's a shortened calendar and this and the other. But at the end of the day, he's leading the championship at this point. He's beating Seb Ogier and, all the other guys, Nerville. So he's still leading the championship. And, I think it's fully deserved. So there's one round to go. Is that correct?
Yeah, Monza, but it's unlikely. Well, it's looking less likely that it'll run. But of course, he's got a teammate in the same car who's the current world champion. So it's not like he's head and shoulders out in another car ahead of the pack, is it? So.
But sometimes, when you're in that position, when you're leading the championship with everything to sort of lose and nothing, kind of, it's one of those situations, isn't it? With the pressure, you have a mechanical failure or anything else. It's a horrible situation to be in. But fingers crossed that he does that, and I think he fully deserves to be a world champion. And it'd be brilliant for British motorsport. Obviously Lewis Hamilton's going to win the world championship in Formula One again, and if Lewis wins the Rally World Championship, 2 British world champions is fantastic. So.
Yeah, fingers crossed, and do go back and listen to episode 4. We've got some big rally stars on the podcast so far. Now, as we record this on bonfire night, you will hopefully forgive us the distant sound of fireworks with.
And my dog barking. You might hear my dog barking as well. Dog's going apoplectic. It's going crazy. So
we can deal with dogs and fireworks, and with some of the most iconic racing cars and liveries on his CV: Silk Cut Jaguar, Benetton Formula One, Jägermeister, Meister, Alpha DTM, Harrods McLaren F1, and record-breaking supercar tests under his belt. Andy Wallace has had a pretty explosive career. You can forgive me that corny link there as well. And he joins us to talk about it now. Welcome to Spinning Wheels, Andy. Where on earth do we start?
Well, that's a good question, and that's why you're so good at what you do, because you'll find a place, right?
Well, you've just come back from a trip testing a rather fast car, so I suppose we could start there and then rewind right back. So tell us where you've been recently.
Well, I mean, for the last 10 years now it is. I've been doing quite a lot of work with Bugatti and driving some of their hypercars. And I was really lucky. Obviously, I had a very long career in single-seaters, and then the longest part, of course, in sports car racing, endurance racing. And Guy and I drove together. We've been around each other. And we have all been driving some amazing cars that are really fast, or so I thought. And then I'll tell you something. I remember a time when racing cars were really powerful and really fast, and road cars were the opposite. But you know what? It's changed around. Racing cars have got so fast over a lap that, of course, the organisers of the events have tried to slow the cars down.
Yeah.
Over a lap, they're still very fast, but the power output's been cut down. Everything's cut down. So you've now got hypercars which go so much faster than any race car that you could ever imagine driving. And that's what really that shocked me when I first joined Bugatti. It's been impressive trying to understand what you can actually buy these days if you've got rather deep pockets, of course.
This is the Chiron that Andy's talking about, and if you've seen the lap, who was just talking to Guy and I, it looks super composed, but we're led to believe there was a lot more going on inside that car. What speed was it? 300 and what?
304.7724. Not that I remember exactly what it was, but no, I mean, but you know, as Guy will tell you, I mean, as a racing driver, you're quite often doing 200 miles an hour, maybe up to 220 miles an hour. And this is normal, and you get used to that speed quite quickly. And in fact, you actually feel quite comfortable doing 200 miles an hour, isn't that right, Guy? I mean, it's kind of normal.
It kind of feels, yeah.
You know, you're at Le Mans, you're at Daytona. You know, it's kind of normal. So your brain is very, very comfortable at that speed. But then, when somebody says, "Oh, do you fancy driving at 300 miles an hour?" You think, well, that's not that much faster, is it? Really? Or even 250? That's not that much faster, is it? But something happens with speed, although it should be a linear measurement. It really isn't inside your brain. So what I was always trying to explain was, okay, so let's say I always pick 150 miles an hour, because if you're on the German Autobahn, obviously not on the M40, but if you're doing 150 miles an hour in anything, that's actually pretty quick, isn't it? But then if you do 150 to 180, that is a massive jump, and it's only 20% faster. So why is that? Why does your brain perceive it as so much faster? Perhaps it's just the familiarity of the speed or not. But what I can tell you is, to cut a long answer a bit shorter, over 300 miles an hour is absolutely barking mad. And it was something I will never, ever forget. It was really a whole week of build up to this, which is all the engineers gathering data, validating all the aero numbers, Michelin doing a lot of work to make sure that the tyres were okay for that speed. And even before that week started, the weekend before, being given a Chiron, which is limited to 261 miles an hour, given a Chiron to play with for the weekend at the test track with the limiter removed. The first time you go over 260 miles an hour, it just absolutely blows you away. And then I was thinking, then, blimey, so we're talking about over 300. That can't be, it can't be true. Then you start with the program and you start analysing all the data and making sure that you've got the right amount of lift, downforce, front, rear balance, and then finally you do it. And after all that build-up, still the last run is the fastest run, and still it's a shock from the run before, even though it's only maybe 5 or 6 miles an hour quicker. It's crazy.
Do you think there's more in it, Andy, or do you get, or you sort of terminal velocity at that point? Are you kind of stalling out? Do you think, or?
Well, the problem is, in the end, it's all you're going so fast across the ground. You're doing a kilometre every 7 seconds at that speed and a mile in 11 and change. You run out of space, or you certainly do if you're doing it on a track. So this track is 8.8 kilometres long between the banking turns at each end. It's 5.5 miles.
Which track is it?
And it's Erlesine, the Volkswagen Proving Ground.
Okay.
It's actually because I had the world speed record with the McLaren F1.
Is that with Jonathan? Were you Jonathan Palmer back in the day developing that with him?
Well, yeah, Jonathan did a lot of the chassis stuff, and I raced for McLaren, as you say, in the Harrods McLaren for a couple of years, and I ended up getting the job of doing some customer handovers for McLaren, and then in the end they said, "Oh, do you want to go and do this top speed run we're going to do?" So of course I did. That was 214. That was 1998, and I thought that was fast, but the step from 240 to 304 is massive. So yeah, it's the same track, and that long straight, which in the McLaren seemed quite long enough to get the job done. In the Chiron, even though you're coming off the banking at something like 150 miles an hour, you're covering the ground so quickly that in the end, of course, you see the other end coming. The speed is still climbing, but there has to become a point where you lift off and you've got to get the speed down for the banking turn at the end. So was it VMAX? No, it was still climbing, but it's very, very slow, but it's still accelerating. If you made it another couple of miles longer, I'm not sure how fast it would go. But you're covering so much ground. It's incredible. It's like something like 140 meters per second.
You wouldn't make the corner. You're really, yeah, I've got to 305. Oh shit, I've got a corner. It's like,
well, yeah. Well, that's the thing, mate. Because you know, as we all know on the racetrack, when you're trying to get a fast time, you're measuring your braking points, and you're trying to brake a couple of meters later.
Yeah.
Well, because each time you do a run and you validate the numbers and then you go again and you go again, you're arriving at the other end faster. So you don't have any reference point as to where the braking area is. There's a gantry as you get close to the end, but you're aware that this run is pretty quick. You've got more speed than you had at any other time. And you're trying to judge, okay, where's the corner? Where's the gantry? God, everything's coming really quick. You need to pick a spot. And interestingly, though, at the end, the German engineers were checking everything. Yeah, that's the speed. It was over 490 kilometers an hour. And then very dryly, they said to me, yes, but we noticed you lifted about 130 meters too early at the end, to what was possible. So I was like, well, I'm sorry, I was arriving.
You even measure 130 meters at that speed.
Well, exactly. And they said, well, how long, how early did I lift then in time? Oh, yeah, about 0.72 seconds or something. So, well, I'm really sorry. I put my hand up. I messed it up. But you see what I mean? But you don't. If you had several runs at that, you could probably get it absolutely on the nail. Probably the easiest way is just to make the road longer. But that's not really possible. But I mean, this is the thing. You're covering the ground so fast, and there's so much input coming in to you. And I don't know. You have to try to slow some of those inputs down and just try to concentrate on the important things. And as we do at Le Mans, in the dark or when it's raining at night in Le Mans and it's a little bit foggy, you can't really see where you're going, but you've got these landmarks in your mind. So you kind of have another sense of where you are, roughly. And that's what you're trying to do when you're going that fast, because everything's going past so quickly. You need to pick things that you can actually pinpoint where you are. It's a strange thing.
It looked so calm though. I mean, we talked about it before, but I mean, I thought I'll just watch it before we spoke, and I was like, wow, it looks so, so relaxed and so calm. And I was watching the speed going up. I thought, yeah, it looks easy. It looks like it's, but you said it's definitely not easy. Definitely
well, the strange thing is that this track is actually plagued a little bit by crosswinds. So there's windsocks all the way down, and there's trees either side, and then sometimes there's a gap in the trees, and there's some crosswinds. So a lot of the runs were spoiled by that. And you're going along, and you see the windsocks are down, and then in the distance you see one that's pointing left, and you know what's going to happen when you get there. And as you arrive, you're kind of trying to lean against what you think is coming as the wind, but still it blows you into another lane. It's really difficult. So
it must be terrifying.
Well, it is, because there's nothing you can do. This is the thing. You every tiny, like half a millimeter of movement on the steering wheel, and you've swapped lanes. It's ridiculous how, how careful you have to be and how slow with your inputs. But
no, sorry, I think
also, let's say so you do runs, and then all of a sudden the wind will drop, and you get the feeling, right, we should go now because this will be less horrible from the driving seat, if you like. But if you look at I don't know which video you've seen, because there's several of them out there, and one of them, I'm not sure you can get it on its own, but it might quite possibly be the bottom video, and there's 3 videos together. It's actually the raw footage of the run. And if you see the GPS speed readout in the middle of the screen, that big square box, if you look to the right and the left of that screen, you'll see the white lines of the center lane that I'm driving down. So if you look on the right of the screen, you'll see the white lines are right close to the box in the window, and then they go across to the right a bit more, then they come back. If you look at the ones on the left, they go over there, and then all of a sudden they disappear behind the box through the window, and then they come back again. So you're just watching the video, everything looks fine, but if you can see the lines moving that much, you know how much it's moving.
Yeah.
You just for some reason the video doesn't show it. I guess it's the way it's the lens or whatever. But yes, it was moving quite a lot, and I had several runs before the quick run where I got to around about 280 miles an hour, and then I just had this feeling I had no control over the car anymore, and it was swapping lanes, and I'd just lift off around, say, 280, 285 and come back. And a couple of times the engineers said, well, what do you want us to do? What do you need? Because I guess in the end, they don't know whether you lift off because you're just losing your bottle or what. They don't really know. So at one point when they asked me the question, I said, listen, all I would like, if I could just wish for one thing, I don't mind if it's weaving in the lane, but could it just stay in one lane? Then I'll cope with it. I'll be okay. It's when it's like swapping all over the place that it's a problem. the wind died down. They just did a little bit of work on the software, on the steering again. Really clever guys, really fantastic working with these top engineers in their field. And then all of a sudden, when that windsock dropped to almost completely vertical, and it went, I suddenly had this feeling. There is, I should mention, there's a join in the tarmac, which, so the bit where you're accelerating up to speed is new tarmac, and then you cross over this join and you're on the old stuff. And this track is used pretty much 24/7, so it's quite rutted and quite well worn. I actually go over that join, which nobody even notices in a normal car at a normal speed. But in the Chiron, I was convinced it was leaving the ground. So I kept calling it the jump. And I said, yeah. And when I went over the jump, I was doing 430 or whatever kilometers an hour. And they said, why do you call it a jump? I said, well, because it is a jump. They were looking through the data and came back to me the next day and said, you know what? Yeah, that is a jump. You're leaving the ground. So on this particular run, when there was no headwind or crosswind, suddenly I went over this jump and I'm doing like, I don't know, 270 something miles an hour. Boom, and it landed again. It's just a very split second. And as it landed, it felt really stable, more stable than the other runs. So then you know, okay, this is quite good. I'm going to be less affected by this. You obviously keep your foot in it. Yeah. Some seconds go by, the speed's climbing. You then get to a point where it doesn't feel really, really nice, but you know, I've done by this time, I don't know, 20 runs, 30 runs, even more runs maybe. You know that if you don't like it and you lift off because you don't like it, they're going to make you do it again. So if you feel like it's only 3/4 as scary as it was before, you just keep your foot in it.
Pinned.
Yeah, you keep it pinned. And I did. I just kept it pinned and it was moving around. Then it didn't move around so much. And then you see the speed climbing. You think, right, that's it. I'm in now. And you just keep this thing pinned.
Amazing.
It's going faster, faster and faster. And then boom, it went. When I actually passed a radar. There's a radar speed trap on the track, which obviously had only been configured up to, or calibrated up to, I don't know, 450 kilometers. I passed it and it said something like 513 or 516 kilometers an hour, which is like, I don't know, 315 miles an hour or more. I passed that, and then I looked at my reading again, and my reading was like way lower than that. So I just ignored it and kept going, but the numbers kept climbing. And I knew in my head that 483 was 300 miles an hour. And once it cleared that and it was still accelerating, I knew it was a good run.
That's incredible insight.
And then after you finish,
they look so... You just think when you hear these headlines that somebody jumps in a production car and it's designed to do that speed and they just put their foot down and do it. I actually never realised there was so much to it.
Well, I tell you, this is the other thing too. With Guy and me, we're driving race cars, and race cars have a lot of downforce. This is what they're designed for. And even if you go to a track like Le Mans where you're relatively low downforce because of the high speed, you still have a good bit of downforce front and rear. So the stress is on the tyres at that speed, the tearing force that the tyres have to withstand. I was in some press conferences with Michelin after this and listening to those engineers explaining it. So there's a tearing force of 7 tons at 300 miles an hour on the tyres. So just to get that into perspective, a Chiron weighs almost 2 tons. So you're talking about, you can pick up with one tyre 3.5 Chirons, and that's the load that the tyre's going through. So it's an horrendous amount of force. So of course, before you even attempt something like this, they go to their tyre testing rig, and also, by the way, the wheels need to be tested at the high speed too. So they went to the rig, and in fact, the only rig in the world that can test the tyres up to that speed is the rig that they use to test the space shuttle tyres. So they're there, and what you have is this big drum, and you can put the tyre up against the drum, you can take it up to the high speed, and then you can add the load of the car, you can put some tow, some camber, your pressure up and down, and you can see how fast you can take the tyre up to. Wow. So, of course, they did all this work, but when they came back to Bugatti, they said, listen, you can easily exceed the speed that you think you can go, but one stipulation is we don't want any downforce. So now what you're trying to do is, it would be easy if you put a few 100 kilos of downforce both ends, the thing would be stable. So they're asking, could we try to achieve 0 front and 0 rear downforce? on the car. So as we all know, as the speed increases, the aero balance migrates. So generally, the faster you go, it migrates towards the rear. So if you start off with, let's say you start off with 50 kilos of downforce on the front at 200 miles an hour, by the time you get to 250, you've probably got nothing on the front. And by the time you get to 300, you've got lift. And correspondingly, you're getting more on the back. So that's why you do a lot of calibration runs to see where you are. And each on the calibration runs, you go a constant speed for 10 seconds and you measure the aero load, front and rear. Excuse me. And then you take that up another 10, 20 miles an hour. You do another 10-second run. And you keep doing this. And this is going over days. This was 1,000 kilometers of running, mostly above 250 miles an hour, taking all these data points to make sure, because it's so easy for, if you're going along, the front's lower than the back, and as you get quicker, you've probably got almost no rake, same front and rear. But if you suddenly gained 10 millimeters of front ride height, it's a chain reaction. Car's gone.
It's an airplane.
It flies. I mean, at Mosport, I did that with the Dyson Lola.
I was going to ask you about that. We'll come to that one.
We'll come to that later, yeah.
Yes.
So it's easy for that to happen. So you've got to be sure of all your numbers, and you've got to be sure that everything you found in the wind tunnel, all the computer-generated stuff is true, and that as the speed increases, you're not gaining too much lift on the front. Again, if you had downforce on the car, you could just nail it down, job done. But this extra load from the downforce would then put the load up on the tyre. So this is what we were asked to do. So the very last data point you can do for 10 seconds is at 450 k's, which I think is 280 miles.
Yeah.
So when you come back after doing one or two or more data runs at 450, 280 miles, you check all the data, you can make a calculation. Okay, so at 300 miles an hour, this is how much lift you'll have at the front. And hopefully it's a good bit less than the static weight of the car. This is how much downforce you'll have in the back. And then you make a calculation and say, okay, you can go, you can do the run. So that's why the car can be a little bit unstable, because you've almost got no downforce and perhaps a bit of lift at the front.
Yeah.
And you've got a crosswind and you've got a road that's quite bumpy.
Yeah.
So now the other thing is, which you maybe you've already thought of this, but I stupidly thought nothing of this. I'm thinking, well, that's great. Well, if the car's got no downforce, it's going through the air and it's really happy going through the air. There's no downforce, there's no lift, it's just going through the air. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. Actually, what's happening at 300 miles an hour, if you achieve 0-0 front rear, you've got under the car 2 tons of downforce, and on the top of the car, 2 tons of lift. So you're now trying to rip the car apart with a 4-ton tearing force just to have 0 downforce. So you see, you don't build a car in your garage and go out and go fast. You trust science, engineering, best engineers money can buy.
Yeah.
And that's how you do this project.
Yeah.
If you want to keep the car on
right,
the ground. So
every force just moves along in the car, doesn't it? It moves somewhere else. You take it from somewhere else, and somewhere else takes the strain.
Yes.
And it's one of those. But I mean, you don't really think, like Paul said, you don't really think. You know, you hear about all these different records and what have you, and you just assume that they go out there and find a straight bit of road and nail it. But there's obviously a lot of work, especially when you get into that kind of speed. I mean, it's super impressive.
That's really opened my eyes, actually.
Yeah. Well, I think another thing to add to that, sorry, is also that we're talking about the Volkswagen Group and we're talking about Bugatti. They don't do things recklessly. They do everything from an engineering-led point of view. So going to do it on a piece of straight road somewhere isn't acceptable, because it's very, very hard to be absolutely sure there is no wild animal running across the road, or there is something on the road that you can touch at high speed. And, you know, you run over a pebble at that speed, you're going to cause the tyre a massive problem.
Yeah.
So they had these enormous great mats that airports use to clean runways. And a lap of this track is 20 kilometers. It's a 5-hour job to take these mats around and clean the entire circuit, and then it's all closed down and only you can use it.
Wow.
So this way you're trying to eliminate all the different risk areas. Of course you can't eliminate everything, but you give yourself the best chance you can. And so that's why we had to do it on this track. It's not long enough now. I mean, it used to be when cars used to do 250.
Yeah.
When you're starting to talk about over 300, it needs to be longer, but it's not.
Yeah.
That's just what an adventure to have been a part of, and what a great place to start as well. But I think right now we need to go right back down. We need to lower the speed right back down to where you started, because it was single seaters to begin with, wasn't it? You did this what in those days when I was a kid growing up watching motor racing, that was what you did. If you wanted to be a racing driver, you went single seaters and through the ranks. That's what you did, wasn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah, and just to join that last conversation back to where you're going with it, in actual fact, since I can remember 6 or 7 years old, my dad first took me to a racetrack. I just loved cars. I wanted to race them. I wanted to drive them, and I've been crazy about cars. And up to today, I'm still crazy about cars. So going down this run and saying how terrifying it is to do it, you're still sat in the daddy of all cars doing the fastest speed. And so however I got there, despite everything else that's going on, I'm really, really lucky. And it's something I'll never forget. So yes, £3 back to the beginning.
You still get the thrill of driving. It's still the thrill of driving, that speed and exhilaration, you're still doing it now, which is amazing. I mean, as a career, it's just fantastic. But I mean, it must be a long cry, far cry from when you were sort of cycling to Silverstone, having what was it, cheese and pickle sandwiches, whatever you're having.
You remembered it was cheese and pickle. It was cheese and pickle because that was in fashion once. I mean, I don't suppose people eat cheese and pickle sandwiches anymore. But yes, I was 30 miles from Silverstone, lived near Oxford. My dad was working all hours, so he couldn't take me to the racetrack. So, I had one of those sprung-loaded racks on the back, cheese and pickle sandwich, off you go to Silverstone. It was 3 hours each way to do this 30 miles on this bike with trucks passing and everything. And yeah, you had a whole day. It was once you found the hole under the fence, because I didn't have money to buy a ticket, you could sit there and watch racing all day long. And that's kind of what I was dreaming about. So yeah, it is a far cry, you're right. But every step of the way with motor racing, I've noticed is you're only ever going to succeed. Well, first of all, if you're incredibly lucky, you'll have to put your hand up to that. But you're only going to succeed if you really, really want to do it above all else. Yeah. And so with that, even though there wasn't any money sloshing around, and I think if you tried to do what both of us did in our racing careers in the beginning, you couldn't recreate it now because the starting cost of racing is much too high.
Yeah.
But back then, if you had a couple of mates and a box of tools, you could sleep in a tent, and you could get the job done for very little money, and that's in fact what I did do.
Yeah, you can go to racing Formula Ford, and it could be dad and lad, or like you say with mates or whatever else. Whereas now, if you rock up, you got to have 250 grand. It's with a big team. It's all the PR and all the rest of it. It just doesn't work the same these days, which is a shame really, because it shouldn't be like that, should it?
How ironic is it that in those days, I mean, when you won the Formula 3 championship, that to win Formula 3 in those days was such a big thing. Now it's not, but it costs a lot more, and as you say, the access to it is a lot higher. Hasn't that gone the complete wrong way?
Yeah, it has. It really has. I mean, you should. Nothing stands still, does it? And I think if you go and have a beer with some friends and you start talking about this, you can convince yourself, oh, it was much better in the old days, and it's just perhaps because we're getting old. Nothing stays still. Everything always progresses. But what was possible then was, with almost no money and not the best equipment, you could actually do a half decent job in the car, and somebody would notice you enough to help you out with a couple of £100 here and a couple of £100 there. Now, without the best equipment, nobody's going to notice you even turned up.
Yeah.
And I think this is the problem. And yes, it is a shame.
But I think Formula 3 back then, was, because they didn't have all the different formulas. You had sort of Formula Ford, F2000, Formula 3, 3000, Formula 1. It was quite straightforward. But Formula 3, out of all of the categories, was the real one where, Formula Ford was always really good. They had the festival and everything else. But when people got to Formula 3, that was the time when the Formula 1 teams are really looking at Formula 3 drivers. That was the point where the maturing, this is where the talent really shone. And I mean, I remember your car. I remember the Warm Star livery. It was a pretty iconic livery. I remember your helmet design, which I was going to ask you about your helmet design, but I'll ask you later on. But you had a fantastic season, and you also won the Macau race as well. But then to go to sort of move on from there to Formula One, was there any opportunities or not without taking money? I guess it was just about.
Yeah, and interestingly, you mentioned all the categories, but the interesting thing was where Formula 2 is. Was always a bit cloudy around that time. So there was Formula 2, there was Formula 3000 came after Formula 2, but it wasn't the definitive step to Formula 1. F3, in fact, was the step to Formula 1. And if you look at all the champions, F3 champions before me, I think I started a trend and made it the first one who didn't make it to Formula 1. Interestingly enough, but yeah, everybody did, and so particularly winning Macau as well, that made a big difference too, because it's such a iconic race, and you had guest drivers coming down from sports car racing from Formula 1 to do that race, so it's a big deal. Although, of course, if you were a current Formula 3 driver, you had a bit of a leg up because you knew the cars.
Yeah.
I did go and knock on all the F1 doors at the end of '86, having that great season, and I was offered 2 drives, one with Tyrrell and one with Arrows. But they needed $600,000 US.
Yeah.
And if they said $6,000 US, it wouldn't have been possible.
Yeah.
So it was an absolute non-starter. But what saved me, because to be honest, I did Formula 3 in '85, and up until the last race, I was still 1 point between myself and Maurizio Gugelmin. And Silverstone was the last race, and we lined up for the start, and he was on pole, and I was second, and I had my car pointed slightly towards him. The flag went down, I shot off the line and got a better start than him, and I missed the shift to second gear. And I had to fall in behind him, and then he won the race and I came second. So that race, I was second that year. So you can just about get away with doing Formula 3 again, forget the money problem side of it, but you can't win the championship and do it again. There's nothing to gain.
No.
So you go to F1. That bit in the middle, Formula 3000, yes, I did end up doing some races in Formula 3000, but it's incredibly expensive and it's really difficult to do.
Yeah.
So at that point, it could just have been that the career finished completely. But during that Macau race, this is in the end this is where the massive luck comes in.
This is a good story because I've read about this one.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, and you can find this bit that I'm going to talk about on YouTube, but it's such a difficult